Andrew and Courtney Simpson, although childless, had been happily married for over a decade. Having children was something they both wanted, but waited until they were confident in their careers and could financially support their family on one income. They were both in their 30s and were successful lawyers. Drew was a civil law litigator and court-practiced contract law for a prominent local firm in their hometown. They had finally reached the point financially where they had agreed to attend their first American Bar Association National Convention. It was something they both had once looked forward to during the long drive to the headquarters hotel, where they had reservations for the event. Their main conversation was about the baby. They both agreed it was time, but Court admitted she was anxious about the prospect. It was at the board of directors reception on Wednesday night that things fell apart. It had started well enough when they were both enjoying the atmosphere and the company of fellow attorneys. Jess. It was late in the evening after the formal part of the reception was over, and there was more drinking, dancing, and loud talking when Drew noticed that Court was in a playful mood that definitely wasn't a bad thing, because it always led to marathon sex at the end of the night. Courtney was a beautiful woman with a lively personality, albeit somewhat dodgy, and always flirtatious. Tonight was no exception. Drew, on the other hand, was more calm and reserved. This was very unusual for a trial lawyer at social gatherings. Drew tended to blend into the background. He really enjoyed watching people and how they interacted. If someone started a conversation, Drew would immediately actively participate. He was just rarely the first to strike up conversations with people he didn't know. He had spent an inordinate amount of time on the dance floor this evening with numerous partners and was looking forward to returning to their hotel room. His eyes lit up as he met his gaze with his wife's dark green eyes. She had that smoky, sexy look in her eyes, and he was ready to take her right there in the club. She leaned forward, revealing most of her thigh and lush breasts. She let out a low, approving whisper and purred, "I want to have fun tonight, honey," without taking her eyes off of him. "I can see that I can feel it too. Baby, let him go to the room. Look around, honey. We've never been in this town before. Do you see anybody? You know." Drew looked around reflexively. "No, I don't think so. What's the matter? I want to have fun tonight." He couldn't help but notice the heavy emphasis on the I. He was stunned. He had no doubt realized what she was talking about. But although he was deeply shaken and badly wounded like a seasoned trial lawyer, he instinctively knew not to show his true emotions. Drew couldn't imagine where it came from. The only thing he could point to as a possible warning sign was his wife's reluctance to have a child. And yet she had just agreed to do just that. "I see, but what about our relationship?" She ignored his question. She wasn't a trial lawyer, but she knew how to question witnesses and knew not to let her opponent distract her attention. She sighed and held his hand firmly on her vulva. "Have I been a good wife in the 15 years we've been together? Have you ever had the slightest doubt about my love and total devotion to you since we became exclusive freshman year? Name one time, one instance, just one." "I know I flirt, but have you ever had any doubts about me when you've watched me do it?" You'd think she had just made the simplest of rookie mistakes a lawyer can make, asked a question she didn't know the answer to. But in truth, there was no mistake, because she knew the answer. No, there wasn't. "I never had any doubts about your commitment to our relationship until 30 seconds ago." Why, now he had accepted the inevitable. It was amazing how quiet she seemed in the middle of a nightclub with flashing lights, loud music with pounding breasts, and a DJ with over 200 drunken lawyers crowded around her in the midst of it all. They spoke in a normal voice, but they didn't miss a syllable from each other. "I told you I'm ready to give birth. I just want this weekend to be for me. I deserve it. And on Monday, I'm throwing away my birth control pills for the sake of our future." She pushed his hand away, leaned back in her chair, and crossed her arm over her chest, emphasizing her ample cleavage and letting him know the conversation was over. "I understand. Have you chosen anyone yet?" He naturally already knew the answer to his questions. She answered quietly but firmly, "Okay. One last question. What reward are you willing to pay? What kind?" "Of reward? Don't fool around with me. You're a contracts lawyer. You know what the remuneration is? What are you offering me for consideration? What price are you willing to pay now?" He was close to losing control. He was dumbfounded at how quickly his life was falling apart. "Honey, the only price in question is your ego. I know that by doing this, I will hurt you, and I will spend the next 30 years making that pain go away. It has nothing to do with what we have. It's Wednesday night, And we don't have to check out until Saturday morning. I'll be back in our hotel room Friday night, and we'll start practicing making babies. It's going to be okay. It was over 15 years together, over 10 years of marriage, the end of our family. That would never be. No baby showers, birthday parties, first days of school graduations, brides or grandchildren bouncing in our laps. She just admitted to willfully hurting her husband, deliberate misbehavior, if you will, and she didn't even blink. For some reason, it didn't matter to her, all right? I'm going to bed. I don't know when I'll see you. He turned and walked away without looking back. He heard her calling for him, but he no longer cared what she said. Well, that went better than I expected, Courtney thought smugly to herself. What was that? I don't know when I'll see you thing. She thought no more about it and turned her attention to her intended target. She looked into his eyes and smiled seductively. She stood up and crept toward him. She couldn't remember his name, but she did remember that they had done some dirty dancing recently. The incredible truth was that until that very moment, she'd never once considered being unfaithful to Drew. She'd suddenly made a life-ruining decision that she really just hadn't imagined Drew didn't know how he managed to get back to the room. He vaguely recalled someone asking if he was okay while he was in the elevator, but his head was spinning and he was in mild shock at what had happened. Everything seemed so unreal. Just 1 minute he was fantasizing about the great sex he and Court would have, and the next minute his marriage was over. He wasn't sure how long he sat on the edge of the bed staring at the wall. But eventually a plan formed. He knew what he had to do and forced himself to go forward. It was only a 3-and-1/half-hour drive home, but Drew knew he had a couple days to get everything done. He realized that to Courtney, he didn't exist for the next 48 hours. He had plenty of time to do what needed to be done. He realized that first thing in the morning, he needed to report their joint credit cards stolen. If he was lucky, some hotel maid would find Court's purse she'd left in the room and take it without reporting. Drew wasn't going to touch anything his soon-to-be ex-wife had left in the room. He also figured that having the hotel maid pick up the purse would at least give him until Tuesday. The divorce itself would be simple and clean. They lived in an immaculate state, no children, no house, no joint assets. They had always kept their finances separate and contributed to expenses equally. They made about the same amount of money. But the divorce was the easy part. Starting over was the much harder part. Drew quickly packed his suitcase and was ready to head out the door. He paused for a moment and considered leaving her a note, but then changed his mind, stepped out into the hallway and headed for the elevator. The sound of the room door automatically closing echoed down the hallway and signaled that he was closing the door to his previous life. A thought occurred to him on the way to the lobby, and he stopped at the front desk to see if everything was okay. My wife is in the car. We have an emergency at home and need to leave immediately. We left the keys in the room. He saw the officious clerk press a couple of keys and realized the cards were inactive. He couldn't help a slight smile as he walked outside, knowing how much trouble Courtney would be in a couple days. 7 years later, Drew sat in the hotel restaurant sipping iced tea and waiting for his food to arrive. The seminar had indeed been interesting, and it should be a valuable learning experience to help him in his family law practice. He noted that the date on the paper someone had left on the worn vinyl seat was almost 7 years since his final divorce. Wow, time has flown by. At first, he didn't realize he'd said it out loud, and slightly embarrassed, looked around to see if anyone had heard him. He hadn't thought about Courtney in a long time, although his divorce was relatively easy. The experience made him realize how unfair the so-called no-fault system can be to the party who has been treated unfairly. Honestly, though the system existed because some people can't handle their own, they acted like children and tried to wreak havoc on the other side, and the system has to step in and solve it for them. These were the cases where the old axiom, "no one wins in divorce," is actually true. In any case, it was the motivation Drew needed to change his major to family law. The truth, as he discovered, was that most divorces these days really only have happened because both parties have made up their minds. There were few arguments and both parties worked to end their situation as quickly and painlessly as possible. He dealt with any case that was presented to him. However, he did enjoy dealing with the relatively rare case of adultery, and he suspected that his client's spouse was trying to tighten the screws on his client. His musings were abruptly interrupted by a voice he still recognized. "Hey, Drew, how you doing?" He looked up and unbelievably saw her. He couldn't have been more shocked to be hit with a cattle prod. "Hey, Court, believe it or not, I was just thinking about you. What are you doing at the family law seminar?" "I'm not attending. I'm here on another matter. Can I sit down?" "I'm sorry, of course." He gestured for her to sit down. "I'm really shocked to see you, so you'll have to forgive my manners. Wow, I really don't know what to say." She sat up straight and spoke in an angry tone. "You never even spoke to me, Drew. You never responded to any of my attempts to contact you. You never said another word to any of my family, including my mother, who you know loved you very much. You didn't even show up to any of the hearings, you just walked out. I had nothing to say to you 15 years together, and you couldn't even say you before you ran away. I went up on our front porch that Monday night and was served divorce papers before I could get through the door. When I finally got inside, there wasn't a single thing in the apartment that reminded Ed me of you or our marriage. I see you destroyed our marriage in the blink of an eye with an incredibly selfish act, and the bad guy is me, if that's all you have to say. Just go away and leave me the hell alone, Drew. I'm sorry, just get out of here. Court now." He turned black with rage. Most of the restaurant was now looking at them. She stood up and stumbled away in tears. Just at that moment, a whirlwind came over Drew. It was the chattering twin sister and their little sister. They came at him full speed like they usually did. His wife was right behind them. She was laughing and smiling, but her smile quickly disappeared when she saw his face. Her gaze flickered to Courtney's rapidly receding figure. "That's her, isn't it, Drew?" He could only nod his head as he was preoccupied with the 3 children. Without another word, his wife Celia rushed after Courtney. In a flash, Drew followed her movements with his eyes. As she caught up with Courtney, they engaged in a conversation that ended with Celia helping Courtney sit down. They must have talked for at least 10 minutes. They seemed to exchange contact information. Then Celia gave Courtney a hug and they parted ways. Celia went back to the table and grabbed their youngest, so Drew would have a chance to corner the twins with a fight. Drew's eyes and mouth were wide open when Celia sat back down. "She's coming over to our house in a couple weeks, and you two are going to talk. I mean, really talk. Don't say anything, just nod your head if you understand. Her tone didn't allow for any objections, so he just nodded and started fighting off the 2 little monsters in his lap that were now his life later that night in their hotel room after the 3 musketeers had fallen asleep. Celia looked at him and asked, "Is there anything you want to say or ask her?" He took a deep breath and spoke. "Softly, the first few years I wanted to, but I guess my pride wouldn't let me. But now, no, I have nothing to ask, and I'm glad I didn't give her the opportunity then. What you're joking, it can't be serious, can it? It's very serious, Celia. If I'd let her talk to me, then maybe she could have said something to make me change my mind. But then I'd never have met you, and our 3 children wouldn't exist. No, I don't need to talk to her, and I don't regret anything." She put her arms around her husband and showered him with kisses. "You know what to say to a girl, don't you, baby? But the poor woman needs to talk to you, so the least you can do is sit and listen." "I will, but really, what's the point? All she's going to say is how sorry she is. If I ask her why, she'll say she doesn't really know, etc., etc. But I'll do it for you. And maybe it will help her calm down, but why would I do that? Drew, be nice. Now, maybe I can't define it for you, but maybe you would yell at her within a couple minutes of seeing her. Maybe that's what will close the past for you too. Maybe you're right, but even if you and the girls are taken out of the equation, I realized even before I met you that my life was better without her. The divorce made me reevaluate my life and what was important to me. Oh, sure, I went through the usual emotional turmoil that most people experience when a marriage fails, but that failure made me take a hard look at myself, something I never would have done if she hadn't acted so foolishly." Drew paused to think and catch his breath. They say that our greatest successes can be the result of our greatest failures, and I firmly believe that's true. In my case, I am much happier practicing family law now than I ever was practicing civil law. Sometimes I start to feel like I'm actually helping people I know. I don't make as much money, drive a Beamer, or live in a suite overlooking the lake shore, but I'm happier than I've ever been in my life now. What about her? Maybe you should ask her that question. What's the point, Celia? I don't have the slightest regret about where I am right now. He paused and continued in a voice a little louder than a whisper. It may not be true. I do have one regret. I should have spoken to her mother. She really is a lovely lady. I know she loved me, and I liked her since both my parents are long gone. She was like a surrogate mother to me. And I left without saying a word to her. Celia really couldn't say anything more. She had hoped that somehow getting together would be as good for Drew as it was for Courtney. But now she had doubts as to whether that was the case. Would she force it on Drew, and it would only serve to bring out a past he no longer cared about? But would she be able to stop it? As it turned out, Celia didn't have to do anything. The meeting never took place the night before Courtney was due in town. Celia's phone rang after midnight. At the time, she was always afraid to answer the phone for fear of bad news, but she reflexively answered it. On the other line was a clearly distraught woman, Celia. "This is Angela Jones, Courtney's mother. I need to speak to Andrew." The ringing phone woke Drew, and Celia handed him the receiver. "It's for you, Andrew. It's Angela. Courtney committed suicide yesterday afternoon." This statement was followed by the sobs of someone in so much pain it's impossible to describe. "I'm so sorry, Mom. I don't know what to say. Oh, God. It's my fault." Drew's tears were flowing now, but there were no words. Celia, who had heard all of this, had clung tightly to her husband and was now openly crying, thinking that there was some guilt in this as well. "Andrew, it's not your fault. She had a lot of problems, and she brought them on herself. There's a lot you don't know about her since the divorce. She left you a sealed letter. I hid it from the police. No one knows it exists except you and me. What do you want me to do with it?" "Andrew, just keep it to yourself for now and let me think about it." "Can you do that?" Sure. Andrew, I need you to be with me. Can you come? I'll be there as soon as I can, Mom. I'm going to bring my whole family with me. I want you to meet them. I know you'll like them. I'll call you back tomorrow and we'll make a plan. Is anyone with you right now? You shouldn't be alone." "Yeah, my friend Joyce is staying with me. I can't wait to meet your family I'll talk to you tomorrow." And the phone went dead. Courtney's memorial service was held 7 days later on a cold but clear fall afternoon, and as promised, Drew and his family were there. There were only a few people in the audience, apparently. Even though Courtney was a very competent attorney, she had no real friends. She was cremated, and the ashes were to be scattered in a park that she and Drew often visited when they were dating. Angela said it was the happiest time of Courtney's life. Losing her daughter by her own hand had been an almost unbearable burden for Angela. But she quickly grew to love Celia, and especially the three girls. By the end of the week, the girls were calling her Grammy. Angela revealed what happened to Courtney's life. After Drew left, he was shocked by the revelations about the risky behavior, substance abuse, and mental health issues that followed the divorce. She even explained the reason why Courtney was in the same hotel as Drew. She disappeared with two men she met at a nightclub and was gone for over a week when she returned. She was covered in bruises, according to Angela. There was nothing unusual about that. Courtney was also close to losing her partnership at work. He was amazed at how one bad, sudden decision had thrown Courtney's life out of control. The night before Drew's family was to go home, he and Celia had a long talk and came to some decisions. The next morning, Drew took Angela aside while Celia kept the girls occupied. "Mom, we need to talk about a couple of things. First of all, Celia and I want you to come live with us. There's nothing keeping you here right now. You don't have to make a decision right away, but we want you to think very seriously about it. We'd like you to be with us. If you decide, we'll be here to help you move. Please think about it, okay? Oh, honey, that's so sweet of you. I promise I'll think about it carefully, but I'm going to miss her so much, and she couldn't take it again." Drew put his arm around her while she tried to calm down. When she calmed down, he continued, "We need to talk about the letter. I think the best thing we can do is to take the letter and throw it unopened into this fireplace. It's a letter to you. Andrew, I know, but I'll never read it if you give it to me. I'll burn it. However, I want to give you the opportunity to keep it. I don't know about you, but I want my memories of Courtney to last until the divorce. Your memories should also be of that time, and I worry that if we read this letter, we will remember her as she became after the divorce. I want nothing to do with that damned letter. I'm giving it to you if you decide to read it. The only thing I would ask is that you never, and I mean never, mention anything about it to me." Angela was shocked by his answer, but began to understand Andrew's reasoning. She desperately wanted to remember her daughter as she had been before her actions had fractured her life. Maybe there was genuine remorse there, and an acknowledgement of how painful her decision had been. but maybe there was. Only more pain inside Andrew told her about how the meeting with Courtney had gone a few weeks ago. What if Courtney only had more anger and guilt to unleash on Andrew? Courtney wasn't in the best mental state, especially since confronting Angela was tearing herself apart before they left for home. Celia also had a private conversation with Angela. Please, please, please come live with us. We really want you to be a part of our family's life. I don't think you realize how important you are to Drew. I promise, honey, I'll think about it. It would be nice to be around young people again, Angela said thoughtfully. As Drew and his family drove home together with tears and hugs, Angela collapsed into a chair in the living room across from the fireplace. She pulled out the letter and stared at it intently. She knew she had a decision to make. I was sitting at the kitchen table enjoying a bowl of granola when I was surprised by a sharp knock on my kitchen door, pondering who it was that would be knocking at 8 o'clock on a Sunday morning. I strove across the tile floor and opened the door. Standing on my porch was a man in his mid-40s wearing a cheap crumpled suit. Behind him stood 3 uniformed police officers. This was definitely not a normal Sunday routine. "Mr. Young," the suit asked, waving his badge, "do you mind if we come in and ask you a few questions? I'm afraid I can only talk to one person at a time, Detective." "What was your name again?" "Cook, Detective Richard Cook. I'll be asking the questions, Mr. Young. These men would like to inspect your home, if you don't mind," the detective added. "Do you have a warrant? I've seen enough cop shows to know that you need a warrant to break into my house to look around, as you put it." I stated, "No, sir, we don't have a warrant. I'm asking for permission for these officers to look around your house. You have the right to deny my request. Then I'll have to get a warrant." The detective agreed. I really couldn't remember what I would have to hide, but I didn't know what they were looking for. Illegal porn on my laptop. Doesn't ring a bell. Couple of dead bodies in the freezer, probably still unlikely. Right, a couple of illegally copied DVDs. "You're not Interpol, are you?" I asked quickly. "No, Mr. Young, believe me, we're not interested in illegally copied movies. Everyone's always worried about that," the detective admitted, shaking his head slowly. "Would you mind telling me what this is about?" Then I asked politely, "Quite unusual for this neighborhood. Why do you want to search my house, sir? There's been a murder and I'm investigating it. These officers are helping me. Is there a reason you want to deny my request?" Detective Cook asked. "Well, yes, because I can, because I don't want a bunch of strangers wandering around my house, because the floors are clean and I want them to stay that way or my wife will give me hell when she wakes up." I replied, "Is that reason enough? How about I drag your ass down to the station and interrogate you for 5 or 6 hours while my colleagues get a search warrant and go through your clean house with a fine-toothed comb?" Cook growled. "You gentlemen can go in and look around while I entertain Detective Cook," I said, addressing the 3 uniformed police officers. I wasn't sure why the cops were so eager to search my house, but I was pretty sure they wouldn't find anything horrible except maybe those damn tags the kids had ripped off their mattresses and carried past the cash register 15 years ago. If tensions escalated, Cook could go to Penn State and arrest both of my sons at one time. I had no tongue to warn them about the illegality of removing those damned labels. I pointed to Cook's chair as 3 uniformed men entered the kitchen. I watched as they slowed down and stopped at the island in the center of the room. They turned almost simultaneously to look in my direction, only one at a time, I muttered, as this holy trinity dived into my box of fresh donuts. I had bought a dozen jelly donuts minutes before they arrived, and their aroma triggered their professional instincts. At that moment, my wife June entered the kitchen, treading carefully, holding the collar of her robe tightly to her throat. "Steve, what's going on? Why are police officers walking around our house eating donuts? Is something wrong?" she asked worriedly. "June, this is Detective Cook. I hope he will enlighten us about the situation by asking his questions." I allowed them to look around, which was the euphemism Cook called the action detective. "This is my wife, June. Why don't you tell us why you're here investigating a murder? Mr. Robert Morgan was shot and killed last night around midnight. I suppose you both knew him well." "Yes, he was June's boss. You must have no shortage of suspects. Cook B, that bastard, was making cuckolds faster than rabbits breed. You should be looking for a jealous husband, maybe even a whole platoon." I grinned, feeling no sadness at all over the death of my wife's late employer. No one else even smiled. June's face turned whiter than I'd ever seen it, and tears came to her eyes. Cook only nodded slightly, studying my face except for June's quiet sobs. The room was dead silent. "Mrs. Young, how long have you been having an affair with your employer, Robert Morgan?" the detective asked. "I didn't really have an affair with him. I mean, really," June sobbed. "It was more of a chance encounter. I wasn't in love with him or anything. We first met. Probably about 6 months ago. I would never shoot anyone, much less Bob." "I never suggested that, Mrs. Young. I'm just trying to get all the facts." Cook said dryly, "How your husband reacted to your affair with Mr. Morgan, was he jealous, angry when he found out Steve had no idea I'd cheated on him until that moment?" "Mr. Cook, the subject, of course, was never discussed between us. I'm sure Steve would have been upset, but it wasn't enough to kill Bob," June replied, albeit with less conviction than I would have liked from my wife. "Really," grumbled the detective, "Mr. Young, how would you answer the same questions? They started sleeping with each other on August 9th of this year." I answered calmly. It was after a dinner party at the Morgans. I'd been called in early because of work problems. He offered June a ride home and slept with her in the backseat of his SUV. I'm not upset because June and I have an unspoken agreement. Simply put, we can sleep with whoever we want, and we do. My revelation made June's mouth drop almost to the floor. It took her a few seconds to process all the information I had just dumped on the detective. I could see the wheels in my head turning very slowly. "How come I've never heard of this so-called agreement?" June asked indignantly. "Lie, because that's what the word unspoken means, dear." I replied quickly. "If we were discussing it, I would say that you and I had a verbal agreement, and if we signed and notarized it, it would be a written agreement. Our agreement was unspoken. Well, it would have been nice if I had known about it." June said, "I've tried awfully hard not to let you know about Bob. I think from now on, all our agreements should be verbalized or even documented. This wading through crap is getting on my nerves. The answer to that question doesn't strike me as comprehensive." Cook admitted, reaching into his shirt pocket and pulling out a small tape recorder. "You both should know that I record everything you say. Mrs. Young, did you date other gentlemen, or was Mr. Morgan your only lover?" "Of course he was," June protested, perhaps overemphasized. "I am a married woman. How can you even ask me such questions? As far as you know, your husband took advantage of this unspoken agreement or was completely faithful to you. Cook, ask Steve, would never break our marriage vows." Detective June replied somewhat indignantly, "Heck! As faithful as an old dog. You can have that on record, Mr. Young. I'm asking you the same questions again. Do you agree with your wife's answers?" June has been sleeping with her colleague Bill Anderson since September 15th, not counting the ties with those two aforementioned. She's as loyal to me as that damn geyser that proudly bears that name in one of our national parks. I answered without emotion. June let out a barely audible sigh. "You seem like a remarkably well-informed husband, and even more surprising is your lack of emotion." The detective remarked many men would be angry and consider murder if they knew their wife was entertaining. "Two lovers, why are you so calm about all this? Mr. Young, like I said, we have an unspoken agreement. June did it practically out in the open, but I was more restrained, if you know what I mean." I smirked shyly. It seemed like June was about to have a stroke. Her eyes had stopped shedding tears. Now they were just popping out of their orbits. Her face was now bright crimson rather than white, and she was crushing a jelly donut with her left hand. The jelly seeped through her fingers and dripped all over her robe, though she didn't even seem to notice it. "In other words, are you saying you had a mistress too?" demanded an answer from the astonished detective, "and it seems that your wife didn't know about it. Who was your affair with, and when did it begin?" "Mr. Young, you're very perceptive. No wonder you became a detective before you were 50, I replied. "Riley, I first made love to Janet Morgan on August 11th, 2 days after her husband slept with June in the backseat of his car. We've managed to do it almost every weekday since then," I fondly recalled in shock. June brought her hand up to her temple. The action caused the jelly that had been in her hand to settle on her forehead. She didn't seem to notice, and Cook was too polite to get her attention, especially since he was struggling to form a coherent sentence. "Good God, you slept with the widow of a murder victim!" he exclaimed. "I interviewed her briefly last night, and she didn't mention your name once. Is there any chance you're mistaken or trying to make a joke? You want to hear her mention my name? Cook, hide in her bedroom closet the next time I cover her, and you'll hear her call my name. Of course I'm not wrong. I distinctly remember the names of all the women I make love to, damn it." I stated emphatically, "You said you sleep with women, plural." "Mr. Young, do you have more than one mistress now that you ask? I must admit that I've been doing the mambo, a Cuban dance with a distinct rhythm horizontal style, with Lisa Anderson since mid-September. We dance several times every weekend, and sometimes even during the week. Jelly was now flowing unimpeded down June's face as she collapsed into a chair in a near coma. State Cook was swallowing some kind of small pill. It appeared to be nitroglycerin, a pill for heart disease, that my Uncle Phil used from time to time after taking a moment to collect himself. Cook rushed forward. "Mr. Young, you must understand that you are having affairs with the wives of two men who are sleeping with your wife. May I suggest that this is not a coincidence? I can even tell you that I've seen Mrs. Anderson, and she's very hot. I'm not going to tell you what you can or can't assume. Revenge is having the wives of your wife's lovers. Sweet revenge is even sweeter, and I've been lucky enough to experience that incredible high." I replied with obvious pleasure, "You mean you killed Robert Morgan to avenge his affair with your wife? Hell, you brutalized his wife every goddamn weekday. Isn't that enough for you?" Cook demanded an answer. "The answer to both of your questions is an emphatic no. In due time, you will realize my ultimate revenge." "I promised. What the hell questions did you just answer no?" to the puzzled detective asked, fiddling with his tape recorder to replay his earlier questions. "So are you saying you didn't kill Robert Morgan? Or are you saying he wasn't killed for revenge?" Cook asked after hearing his own questions. "I can answer yes to both of those questions I answered, damn it," roared Cook. I must remember to ask one question at a time. It was at that moment that one of the uniformed police officers brought a large pistol into the kitchen and waved it in front of Detective Cook's incredulous eyes. "I found this in the gun cabinet in the basement." The officer glowered. "You want to mark it as evidence and admit it." "That's an excellent idea," Cook exclaimed. "Be sure to have it fingerprinted at the lab. The owner of those prints is either a cold-blooded killer or the dumbest son of a in the world." The cop blushed slightly as he walked out the door, holding my .44 Magnum in one hand and my donuts in the other. "It's starting to trickle down pretty good." The detective grinned, watching the strawberry filling drip from the tip of June's nose onto the kitchen table near the box of donuts, no pun intended. "Morgan was shot with a .44 caliber Magnum pistol. Do you own one of those guns, Mr. Young? I saw a .44 Magnum on Bill Anderson one night. It got me thinking, as you... Well, no. Jealous husbands can be bastards and murderers. I realized that I needed a gun as good as Bill's in case he came after me in a rage. Not all men are as understanding as I am, so I went out and bought one. We've got the motive and the gun." Cook smiled now. "All we need is opportunity." "I suppose you spent a quiet evening at home with your wife. Actually, I spent most of the evening inside Lisa Anderson and in her marital bed, to be exact. I left at 11:12 sharp and came home immediately. June was asleep when I got here. I'm not sure Lisa can remember the time since she was quite drunk when I left," I added. "It's certainly convenient. You remember the exact time you left, but Mrs. Anderson was too distracted to remember anything, and your wife was asleep when you got home, I am almost afraid to ask. But how did you remember the exact time when you left the Anderson residence?" Cook inquired. Her husband left a message on the answering machine while I was tormenting his wife's flesh. He said he was on his way home from the airport. It was 10:12. I knew the best he could do it in, that his get home was an hour, so I did my best to leave before 11:12. I met his car driving through their neighborhood as I was heading home. I said, "Even if you left at 11:12, as you claim, you had plenty of time to get to Morgan's house and shoot him when he opened the door. I think we have enough evidence to arrest you for murder." "Mr. Young?" The very satisfied detective stated he was already reaching for his handcuffs when his cell phone rang. Cook gestured for one of his damn boys to follow me when he went outside to keep the conversation confidential. He was gone for almost 10 minutes. The look on his face when he returned told me everything. Damn, Detective Burns just got a full confession from Bill Anderson. He claims he came home from the airport and found his wife dead drunk. He exploded when he noticed a wallet on the floor next to his passed-out wife. It was Robert Morgan's wallet, so he dragged his gun to Morgan's place and put a hole in it that a cat could be pushed through. He tried to deny it first, but broke down under Burns' questioning. "Do you have any idea how Robert Morgan's wallet ended up on Anderson's bedroom floor?" Cook asked. "I have no idea, Cook." I answered quietly. He often left it on the nightstand by his bed. I noticed it several times when I slept with his wife. Why he or anyone else would mistakenly leave it at the Anderson house is a complete mystery to me. It looks like one of your wife's lovers is going to jail for a very long time for killing her other lover. All this time, you had their wives far more often than they had yours. Even though there were two of them now, your wife is sitting here in some kind of trance with her head down in a box of goddamn jelly donuts. It's sweeter that way, was my only answer.